So thanks everyone for who's coming and who are online. I'm very pleased that Shishir is here because there's a train accident in Swindon and people from Bristol going to a meeting in London were sending me messages anxiously saying they're going to be late at the meeting with them. They're going to London and Shishir was on the other side. So either they've conspired and are lying to us, or it's true. You know, you can work out the probability. And Shishir is in Oxford with Kazem, who's the co-author on this work, and is going to present two approaches within observational data for trying to get a little closer to causal effects. Thanks.
Thanks very much, George. Thanks all, and thanks for bearing with my device. I promise I have not conspired with George's collaborators and colleagues here. A genuine accident, but on the train tracks, but thanks very much. So I'll kick it off. First off, thanks very much, George, and the MRC IEU team for inviting us here. It's a real pleasure to be here. We've worked on two papers together. Me, Kazem, and yourself, and in fact, I'll be presenting both of them today. The first paper that we're going to go through is led by Kazem and my DPhil student, Zhang Jian. In fact, it was a paper up till literally yesterday. It was under review. It's been accepted at Nature Communications. So big congrats to Zhang Jian. The second is a work that we did with George in 2023 on paracetamol. So these are the two case studies we'll be looking at, two studies, and we'll be looking at a variety of advanced methods. And despite the advanced methods, we're running into some stubborn biases. So that's what it is. I think let me put this in full screen mode. Is that all right? I realize it's not.
Yeah.
It's not. It's in the PowerPoint mode.
That's it.
Is that better? Okay. Very good. Very good. Okay. So let's kick this off. So what does routinely collected data, electronic health records, bring to the table for causal inference? Well, the promise is we can look at longitudinal, rich, multimodal data on millions of patients, follow them up for many years, especially in routine care, where we see diagnoses captured by doctors, doctors in primary care in the UK, for example, linked to secondary care in hospital practices. We can also see linkage to mortality data if provided, especially in the UK, we get ONS mortality statistics. And we get all kinds of other data sources, such as socioeconomic deprivation as well. See, you know, what is the socioeconomic status of patients as they move through the healthcare system. And one thing that really brings me to...
said that the microphone is currently muted.
Oh, how do you know? Hello?
Anyone any idea how you unmute?
That's working fine for me at
We
least.
can hear you. Yeah, we can.
Oh,
hear
really?
you.
Great, thanks.
Okay, right.
Great. It's probably yeah, okay. So it's okay. So the important thing that routinely collected data can bring to the table here is it could potentially answer questions that RCT can never address, right? It can look at rare exposures, incredibly long horizons, important subgroups, and ask questions about drug interactions, as well as understand real-world prescription patterns. So these are all the things that we can probe using real-world data. That may not be possible in an RCT setting. But what's the catch? This is the promise, but what's the catch? The catch is the validity hinges on proper adjustment. Proper adjustment for the reasons a patient's getting a particular treatment. And the big issue here is confounding. Confounding is where a variable, right, may associate with the exposure, the treatment of interest, as well as the outcome. But more importantly, it's these very invisible type of confounding variables, if I can put it that way. Confounding by indication specifically, which is quite the stubborn obstacle, right? Where the indication for treatment specifically is by nature associated with the treatment, but also associated with the outcome, right? So the big question we have is, can we use advanced methods to address the biases like confounding, especially confounding by indication, and provide proper, robust evidence where trials cannot provide evidence? So we look at two case studies The first is we look at target trial emulation in heart failure patients, specifically heart failure with reduced ejection fraction. Within this, we look at a positive control, where we look at trying to emulate a trial or a meta-analysis of trials, where they show that beta blockers are helpful or protective against mortality, known benefit with using beta blockers with respect to a control arm. And the digoxin trial, the DIG trial, where specifically digoxin was captured as a negative control. There's no known effect, a null effect with respect to placebo or control arm. So the big question here is, can we successfully emulate these trials? The second case study we're going to look at is sodium-based paracetamol, right? Previous works have shown that sodium-based paracetamol is less safe than the non-sodium-based formulations of paracetamol. Is this really true, right? Especially in the case of elderly patients. Is this really true? So throughout these works, just a brief intro primer on the data we use here. So throughout these works, we use UK primary care data, the clinical practice research data link database. And it's great because it offers the primary care view, which is GP records in terms of diagnoses, medications, measurements, also laboratory data. Also, it's linked to secondary care. So you get that whole view of acute admissions to hospitals, hospital stays. And it's as I was previously just briefly mentioning, that you also get mortality statistics in the UK. So with this, you get this comprehensive omnibus view of a patient as they move through the medical care system. And we get to see their healthcare trajectory quite clearly. So the first case study, targeted trial emulation in heart failure with reduced ejection fraction. So beta blockers we've seen versus placebo has an established mortality benefit. The specific hazard ratio that was captured in meta-analyses of trials was 0.69. So it's quite clear that this drug works. On the other end, in the DIG trial, we see a hazard ratio specifically of 0.99, which is with confidence interval over the null. So this drug doesn't work. So a brief introduction to target trial emulation. It's a bit daunting, as I was telling to George earlier, that we have also Jamie Robbins present, who's one of the creators of this framework and has done a lot of work on it. But if I could take a minute to explain it to the best of my abilities, it would be, we want to run a trial, but we can't, right? So what we do is we design the trial as best as we can on paper, and then we emulate it using retrospective observational data. So what we do is first we define the eligibility criteria in a trial, right? We do that, and we want to do the same in observational EHR. So we do that as well. So in our case, we're looking at heart failure with reduced ejection fraction. The second thing that we look at is treatment. What are the treatments we're working with? Well, we're looking at two studies here. So one is beta blockers versus a placebo or nothing. And the other is digoxin versus placebo control, right? So we try and elucidate that clearly. For example, we use medication codes to identify this in retrospective data. Third, we identify time zero. We get this very clearly put down. We want to point in time where two things converge: the assignment of the exposure, right? So if that's beta blocker, when the patient took beta blocker, as well as the start of follow-up. So we don't want any time between these two. If you leave time between these two, it opens up the study to biases and time biases and whatnot. So we don't want to go towards that. We want to align these two concepts at a single time point. So what we do in observational EHR is we use monthly trial entry windows. I'll get into that briefly, but in a bit, but that's how we do it. Now with outcomes in the trial, we define the outcomes very clearly. In our case, we're looking at mortality. So we define that very clearly, and we use Office of National Statistics mortality records with linkage to get this data in the follow-up period following initiation of the drug or the non-initiation for that particular patient. Then we look at the causal estimate of interest, right? So we want to look at maybe a continuous outcome. We use some kind of risk difference. We use risk ratio for binary outcomes, hazard ratio. We define this very clearly. And then what we do is, in our work, we do an adjusted intention to treat effect. In this case, we didn't look at per protocol or as treated. We just wanted to see what were the outcomes captured in the outcome period following exposure initiation. So coming back to time zero and this in an example, So I drew up this graphic to give an example of how we do this, right, in observational data. So let's take these 5 hypothetical patients, right, in medical history. We have data from 2010 to 2015 or so. Patient 1, they are eligible to start being recruited into this hypothetical target trial or observational study around month 2 or 3 within 2010 to 2015. They are recruited in month 3, for example, as a control patient. In month 4, they're also recruited as a control patient. Month 5, they're also recruited as a control patient. So basically, each patient now is an individual unit in our data set per month as month moves on. However, in month about 15, 16, somewhere there, they start beta blockers. Okay, so now they are not in the control arm anymore. That patient is, as a unit, is now recruited into the beta blocker arm. Now, they use beta blockers for the rest of the study period. So they are no longer eligible for recruitment in any other subsequent trial entry windows. Patient 2, well, they start around month 5, 6 or so, control, and then they start with the intervention, say beta blockers, at month 11 or 12, around there, and close to 2011. They use it up till 2012, maybe January, February or something, and they stop using it. So they're not eligible for recruitment for sure during that period because they're not beta blockers. But importantly, they are also not eligible for recruitment back into the control arm because we enforce a washout period, a 12-month washout period following end of beta intervention usage, plus 12 months. And then they die in January or February of 2013. That's the end of their follow-up history. Patient 3 and 4, we see that they are in the control arm for the full study, their eligible period. And 5, they start beta blockers but immediately stop. And then after the 12-month point, which is 2015, they're eligible to start being recruited for the control arm. So this is an example to see how people move in and out, and units move in and out of enrollment periods. This happens across the data set. So in GIST, we see for our beta blocker association study, we have 417,000 patients. Now, of these are the unique patients are much less, but these are the units recruited throughout the period, as I was saying. Now, of those, about 8,000 are initiators. In the digoxin cohort, we have about 1.7 million patients. Of those, 13,000 are initiators. And at the various baselines, right? Every month, every trial entry month window is a baseline. And every one of those baselines, we extract covariates, demographics information, comorbidities, medication use, region, and what year we're in, right? And our outcome is 2-year all-cause mortality. So we use 4 adjustment methods here to get that ITT, the intention to treat effect. What we do is the first 3 are well-known, propensity score matching. We use caliper distance to match patients. Inverse probability weighting. We do trimming to make sure there's no extreme propensity score values at play. Targeted maximum likelihood, which is a semi-parametric estimation tool, which helps with treatment selection biases. It's instead of reweighting with like IPTW or AIPTW, there's a clever coefficient and a functional version of this to make sure that treatment selection biases are mitigated. And lastly, we use a deep learning model called targeted BERT. It's in GIST a transformer model that represents EHR, and it uses cross-validated TMLE for doubly robust estimation. But just to get into the specifics here a bit, because this comes up later as well. So just zooming in on that deep learning model, how do we actually model patients using our deep learning chassis? We use the BERT model. The BERT model treats EHR as a sequence, like words in a sentence, right? By the way, transformers are the same transformers you see in ChatGPT, the T in ChatGPT, right? So, but instead of using words in a sentence, like ChatGPT, we use EHR codes in a sentence, in a sequence. So let's take a look at this hypothetical patient. They have hypertension at age 50 because they were given, a BP value was taken, and then they're prescribed antihypertensives. And 2 years later, they come back to the doctor and they're diagnosed with CKD at 52. 2 years later, they come back, they're diagnosed with diabetes, and appropriately so, they're offered insulin. So what this represents is not just BP, hypertension, CKD as a static variable. No, It represents CKD in context to the exact time it was recorded, the exact sequence, right? So what does that mean? CKD at 20 is a very different manifestation than CKD at 50 versus CKD at 90. Also, CKD before hypertension is a very different manifestation than CKD after hypertension, right? So this keeps that contextual structure intact as it's recorded in routine care. And what we do is we represent each of these elements you see on the screen as embeddings, high-dimensional vectors, concepts, age, visits, and the position. And then we sum them up and then we feed them to the transformer model, multi-headed cell potential. But basically, it's a feature extraction tool. At the end of the feature extraction tool, you can do a bunch of things. You can do risk prediction, you can do clustering, you can do causal inference. In our case, we're interested in causal inference, so that's exactly what we do. So just to zoom in on the model, what we do is we get that patient embedding for causal inference here, and we do three things with it. We predict propensity score, then we predict the outcome given the patient was not taking the intervention, which is zero treatment. The outcome given the patient was taken. So this enables counterfactual estimation. These three values for each patient is what's pushed into CBT-MLE, right? And then we get a doubly robust estimate of our estimand of choice. In this case, we're looking at risk ratio. So let's start with the beta blocker study. Can our advanced methods, target trial emulation and AI and whatnot, recover the benefit that we see in the meta-analyses of trials? Short answer, no. We see that the RCT benchmark's about 0.69. And the crude is obviously biased. This often happens. It's unadjusted estimate, right? But the propensity score model, the IPTW, TMLE, which are known as, statistical conventional methods, also biased. Deep learning, it's an advanced method, it's an advanced tool, it harnesses all CHR, as we said, still biased, right? We're not able to capture it. Okay, so this is the beta blocker trial, but we wanted to ask the question, maybe let's see if the negative control works out, right? Digoxin. We know there's a null effect. That's what the DIG trial has shown. Can any of the methods capture it? The crude doesn't, but also the four adjusted methods also don't. So the big question is, what is happening here in these two cases? Well, both drugs look quite harmful in observational EHR. It's quite different from the findings that we see in the trials. What is the likely reason at play here? Well, initiators, non-initiators might be differing quite systematically from one another based on heart failure severity, any contraindications they have to drugs based on their multimorbidity history. So we wanted to separate something. Is this confounding by indication playing a role here, or is it just simply methods failure? Well, we couldn't really tell very clearly looking at our emulation of these two trials, right? So we wanted to design a sequence of experiments where we could separate the two. So what we do is we use, we generate semi-synthetic data and we run experiments. So specifically, we take the patients from the beta blocker heart failure reduced ejection fraction cohort, about 300K patients. We capture, we leave their, we don't want to generate anything with regards to their medical history. We leave their medical history intact, their progression up to the point of baseline intact. We keep that realistic correlation structure as I've written. But what we do is we simulate treatment and outcomes with pre-specified mechanisms. We force 5 chronic conditions to be confounders. And then we generate ground truth risk ratio. The ground truth risk ratio that we generate is 0.61. And then what we do for experiments is we ask a simple question. When we adjust for all confounders here, what happens? Can we recover the ground truth with our models? Well, then when we omit a confounder from adjustment, what happens? Can the ground truth be recoverable? Then can we omit 2 confounders? Can the ground truth be recoverable? You can see there's like an iterative pattern that happens here. So we want to see what happens to each method as information disappears from adjustment. When all confounders are observed here in the first case, well, all methods do a pretty decent job. The ground truth is 0.61. We see IPTW doing actually exactly correctly. PSM, TMLE as well doing pretty well. Deep learning doing well as well. So it looks like it's working out. Okay, that makes sense. When It's what strong ignorability says, right? If you can, if you adjust for everything, then if you adjust for all variables that are confounding the association, then the true nature of the association will emerge, right? So that's good. Well, when we omit one confounder, what happens? Well, in the case of IPTW, PSM, and TMLE, we see deviation from the ground truth a little bit. PSM is still doing quite well, but generally speaking, there's a bit of deviation from the other two methods. Well, what happens to the deep learning? It's actually not moving at all. It remains the same. So what happens here? Well, we didn't give that confounder explicitly to the deep learning model ever, right? So even, for example, pretend the confounder was diabetes, okay? The deep learning model works in the following way. If we give diabetes, well, then adjust for it. That's great. If we don't give diabetes in the medical history, well, it will infer it because around diabetes will be the insulin, will be other things like sugar measurements, etc., to show that actually diabetes is very much present, albeit explicitly unrecorded, right? So that emerges quite clearly here. Even without explicit input of the confounding variables, we still recover ground truth to some decent degree. Similarly here, we see that there's further deviation from the three statistical methods and deep learning does preserve it, the ground truth. So with this, we see a particular trend. If we were to extend this to 3, 4, or 5, all 5 confounders being omitted from adjustment, I think that quasi-linear slope would just continue, right? So what does this tell us? Well, in simulation, the methods are well behaved. That's good. That's good. That means we were able to some degree separate out the methods failure from the confounding by indication biases, right? We see that when all confounders are observed, all methods do well. This is great. Deep learning is, of course, robust to even omitted variables and adjustment processes. However, real data, none of them actually recover the trial benchmark. The strong confounding by indication biases persist, especially in high-risk cohorts, such as those with heart failure with reduced ejection fraction. There's probably a lot more going on in the space of confounding, right? Of course, other comorbidities. Heart failure patients often do have hypertension, often do have diabetes, often do have CKD. They also have contraindications to drugs because of this. They also have other issues itself with the heart failure, such as the heart failure severity. How really bad is this patient in terms of health with regards to specifically that heart failure phenotype? And all of these things might not be explicitly captured in the EHR. So in this case, the advanced methods really don't help. It's really not about how advanced you can get with your methodology. And I'll come to this at the tail end when I share my concluding thoughts. But both AI and target trial emulation frameworks do not rescue ground truth from what we know in trials and meta-analyses of trials. So let's move on to the second case study. The published claim regarding sodium-based paracetamol was that sodium-based paracetamol increases systolic blood pressure, the risk of cardiovascular events, and all-cause mortality. The hazard ratio for CVD was about 1.5. The hazard ratio for mortality was 2.0. Now, I've written that at the bottom there. A twofold mortality signal is frankly a clinical emergency. So this drug is used by many patients, especially those who are elderly. So if this is the case, if this is really true, if the signal is true, we should be taking it off the shelf because it's not even prescription-based. Sodium-based paracetamol, as some of you may know, is like Lemsip. Lemsip is that fizzy drug, right, that you put in the water and you drink it. So it doesn't require prescription. And if it's this bad in terms of increasing mortality risk, we need to take it off the shelf. So we want to ask the question: Is this really true? Well, this was partly the logic of the published claim, right, in that paper. Sodium-based paracetamol has sodium bicarbonate. Now, the argument was sodium bicarbonate increases blood pressure, and because sodium bicarbonate increases blood pressure via blood pressure pathways, you get increased risk of CVD and mortality. All right, on paper, that looks fine. Upon a first reading, that looks just fine. But we wanted to actually investigate this, and there's something that bothered us, right? A biological wrinkle, as I call it. Well, we know that salt does increase risk of increased blood pressure and increased risk of CVD events, therefore. But that's sodium chloride. That's not sodium bicarbonate, right? So we know there's a clear pressure effect here. On the other hand, sodium bicarbonate is a completely different molecule. In fact, randomized studies have already shown there's a bit of a neutral effect. In fact, some randomized studies have shown there's even an alternate pressure effect. It doesn't increase BP, it actually might even reduce BP a bit. So really, if this biology and the chemistry, frankly, says no, why does the EHR show this elevated risk of cardiovascular events and mortality? We found that a bit odd. So what we decided to do is we decided to run our own study. We replicated the observational setup by the previous paper. They used the THIN database, which is a primary care database in the UK. We use CPRD, but basically the same setup. We looked at patients 60 to 90 years of age from 2000 to 2014. Whatever the patient started first in this eligible period, they are put in that group. So if they started non-sodium-based formulations of paracetamol, they're in the non-sodium-based formulation group. If they started the sodium-based paracetamol, the intervention of choice, they're in that group. Now, of course, if we just look at outcomes with just this data unadjusted, we're going to get some probably confounded estimates. So we ran target to understand what the adjusted estimates of the association for systolic blood pressure, major CVD, and all-cause mortality could be. The breakdown of key characteristics. We see that there's a greater than 50% prevalence of women in both cohorts. Generally speaking, the non-sodium-based paracetamol group, there's higher blood pressure, higher rate of smoking, more diabetes. But interestingly, we saw a higher rate of dementia in the sodium-based paracetamol group. Let's just put a pin in that. I'm going to come back to that in a bit. So when we did adjusted analyses with targeted BERT, we see that in systolic blood pressure, really it overlaps with the line of parity. So we see a null effect. With major CVD events, 1.03 with confidence intervals over the line of parity. So again, we see a null effect. With all-cause mortality, we see a risk ratio of 1.46, quite confident bounds. So it's a 146% elevated risk. Okay, so what's going on here, right? It might be the case that, yes, the paper by Zhang et al. Found 2.0 has a risk ratio, and we're finding 1.46, 1.5. But basically, whether there's a bit of quantitative differences in material, maybe the qualitative finding here is it does elevate mortality risk. But if the sodium-based formulations, right, were truly causing 46% excess mortality, we would see a footprint via vasculature, right? We would see a footprint on the BP events, the BP association study, excuse me, and the cardiovascular events association study as well. Maybe greater than 1, right, for the cardiovascular event study. But we do not. So something else might be driving the mortality signal. But what is it, right? That's what we want to figure out. We just to give you a bit of a recap, with targeted BERT, we adjust everything up to baseline, which is initiation of the non-sodium-based paracetamol or the sodium-based paracetamol. But just because we capture everything in medical history up to baseline, is that all that's at play? Well, there might be incipient illnesses that have gone wholly unrecorded in EHR, right? That's one thing. Could also be incipient illness which has been recorded late after baseline. So this happens often. With heart failure, for example, this happens very often. Patients may have heart failure for long periods of time before they show up at the doctor or the hospital and they're formally diagnosed with the heart failure. It happens with cancers as well, right? Cancers for a long period of time, then you get diagnosed with stage 3 or stage 4 cancers. So with this, we investigate what I call suspect 1, the unrecorded illness. Well, if there's unrecorded illnesses and they are confounding the association, well, even though they're unrecorded, it must play into the mortality statistics. So with that, we exclude patients who have died in the first month, first 2 months, first 3 months, first 4 months, first 5 months, and do adjusted analyses. We see that in the main analysis, the same statistic, 1.46, then further attenuates down to 1.29 as we exclude the deaths in the first 5 months. So that signal is not robust to who we keep in this data set. Another way of putting it is those patients, regardless of the exposure, were going to pass away inevitably. Then we look at suspect 2, incipient an illness that could be recorded late, right? Well, what we did is we said, yeah, targeted burden adjusts for everything up to baseline, but what's happening after baseline? We looked at the codes that were captured after baseline in the follow-up period, and we look at the prevalence of that in the sodium-based paracetamol group versus the non-sodium-based group. So specifically, pneumonitis, for example, occurred in the sodium-based paracetamol group 5.72 times more than in the non-sodium-based paracetamol group in the follow-up period. Malignant neoplasm of esophagus, which is cancers of the esophagus, 5.34, dementia and Alzheimer's disease, 3.78, dysphagia, Alzheimer's, hemiplegia, so on and so on, right? We looked at this list and we see that there's something binding all these findings together. There's something underlying all of this. It's that they are caused by, they are comorbid with, or they are itself dysphagia, trouble swallowing. So that was an interesting finding. So this was a finding, but it prompted us to think, go back to the bare bones of this problem. Why are patients getting prescribed sodium-based paracetamol? Well, could be the case that they are complaining to their doctor that they have trouble swallowing. Now, this is a symptomatic expression. It doesn't go in the EHR. It's not an actual diagnosis. The symptoms of someone telling the doctor, hey, I have a bit of trouble swallowing. Could you give me something that I could just drink? Yeah, sure. Okay. They could go down that direction, right? Very quickly. And you might not be fully recorded. But also, it's not just trouble swallowing. It's not an innocent sign of something. No, it's actually quite a malignant sign of something. It could be that there's prodromal illness, which is driving that trouble of swallowing in the first place, right? So with that, we put these pieces together. This is the DAG we came up with. Dementia, multiple sclerosis, stroke, cancers all have long prodromal periods. So if they're captured at baseline, they are captured. I flagged dementia now. We saw in the population characteristics table that in the sodium-based group, there were 6.8% of patients with dementia, as opposed to 2% or so in the non-sodium-based group. So we're already capturing some of it, but not all of it, right? So there is some prodromal diseases which are captured after baseline. This causes dysphagia, and it leads the doctor to prescribe sodium-based formulations of this drug as opposed to non-sodium-based. So the problem here is the confounding. Dementia, multiple sclerosis, stroke, cancers, everything I just said, which is comorbid with or caused by dysphagia, also causes mortality. So this is something that's going unadjusted for in analysis. So what we do is we do our main analysis, which is 1.46. We show that when we exclude deaths in the first and third and fifth months, we see attenuation. In addition, we adjust for dysphagia, and we see the risk ratio is 1.40. There's already slight attenuation with respect to the main analysis. Now, when we adjust for dysphagia plus the top 10 confounders, the ones I showed you in this list, my bad, then we see that the risk ratio further attenuates to 1.27. What we do is we do all of the above. We exclude the deaths in the first 5 months and adjust as much as possible for dysphagia and the top 10 confounders. And we see that when we take this holistic approach, risk ratio comes closer to the line of parity. So again, in sensitivity analyses and probing of the main effect size, really doesn't hold up. That 1.46 doesn't hold up. It does attenuate, not overlapping with the null, but towards the line of parity. So what is the lesson hiding in this case study? Well, actually rich data, really rich EHR, and capture of rich EHR can also reproduce the original bias. As I said, we didn't find the 2.0 mortality risk ratio that was found by Zhang et al. By the previous publication, but we found 1.46, so qualitatively it's the same thing. And it did not hold up, right? So it's likely not the truth. Confounding by indication is not just statistics, right? I mean, we drew out the DAG, and that's a quantitative description, but there's a statistical process of adjustment, but it's not just that, it's a clinical problem, right? We need to understand why a drug is given in the first place before we can fully understand and clearly explain the meaning of the estimate we get at the end of our association study. So the key question is why a drug is being prescribed. And lastly, let's not just do the main effect analysis and stop there. And if we just stopped with the 1.46 and submitted, well, that's what would have stuck. But the truth is, we need to continue probing, do sensitivity analyses, do robustness checks to make sure that this signal is strong. And when we did them, it didn't stay strong. It didn't stay strong. So some concluding thoughts. So the advanced methods, do they help with confounding by indication and confounding generally? Yes and no. So target trial emulation does something really, really amazing. It has the ability to give you something that's very hard to put your finger on if you don't use the framework. That is the elucidation of time zero. Well, time zero is really great because when we look at people who are starting a drug, it's very obvious. Time zero is likely, there could be variations of this, but likely could just be that time point where they started that drug. Then we look at the follow-up period. That's fine. Makes sense? That makes sense. However, how about those who don't start a drug? Well, that's a bit of a problem. What's time zero? Is it when they're 5 years old? Is it when they're 50? Is it when they're 100? Which time point do we look at as baseline? Well, with monthly recruitment windows and the framework of looking, even if you just look at one monthly recruitment window, forget the multiple recruitment windows. Well, target trial emulation solves for it. Those who are initiating in that month with the intervention, well, they're in the intervention group. Those who are not, they're in the placebo control group, right? Solves for that. However, does it solve for confounding by indication? No. We have monthly recruitment windows here. So on the other hand, if we had a cohort study with one baseline, only one baseline, then we see the confounding by indication playing a role in one baseline, right? But when we work with monthly recruitment windows over a long period of time, actually the confounding by indication is not at just one baseline. It's at multiple baselines. We see the problem not at one, but the first enrollment window, second, the third, the fourth. So in this way, the confounding by indication problem actually persists. Now, in this way, the TTE does not solve for this issue. AI, well, the question is there. Does it actually solve for confounding by indication and confounding generally? Well, yes and no again, right? When we use rich EHR data, we are trying to capture as much confounding as possible from clinical variables. And we're able to do it to some degree. So going back to the paracetamol example, the risk ratio by conventional methods was 2.0, and we got it down to 1.46. Again, qualitatively not different, but quantitatively, we did adjust for some elements that were not adjusted for in the original analysis. So something is there that we adjusted for, but not all of it. There's still clinical indication that is not present in EHR that is playing a role here. And if we're not adjusting for that, then we are way off base, way off base. So where does that actually leave us? Well, as somewhat of a take-home message here, I think what we've learned in these two case studies is richer the data, the better. Harness everything, right? The data sets that offer the diagnoses, the medications, the procedures, linkage to other data sets is fantastic. It can give us a lot of opportunity to deal with as much of the clinical picture of patient trajectory as possible. Second thing is try and capture everything. Try and use models that can not only capture the variables, diabetes, CKD, any of these things, but the longitudinality of it, right? We see the order in which they come. So AI is helpful for that. And importantly, this is a subtlety that we didn't really get into, but it has to do with the nature of the deep learning architectures. Deep learning, as some of you know, captures the explicit variables, and hence they are adjusted. But they also capture implicit variables through their neural network structure, right? So those hidden interactions of variables that you're not explicitly adjusting for can come to light. Third is when we do our risk ratio estimation, hazard ratio estimation, anything, get that done and then start seeing if there's issues, right? Especially, and this is the punchline, especially if the initial result of risk ratio, hazard ratio is not null. If it's null, you might not have very far to go. But if it's not null and you're seeing something super protective or something that is incredibly increasing the risk of something, of an outcome of interest, there might be some issues, might be confounded. So one thing you could do is just, as we did, look at the clinical rationale for the intervention of choice. Why would a doctor push this intervention in clinical care, right? Second, look at the baseline risk factors. This is not a panacea, but it does give you some indication that there may already be imbalances here and some indication bias is present. The other thing that we could do, and again, I left it off the slide deck because for brevity, is look at the propensity score overlap, right? Especially when you use propensity score models, you could look at the prediction of the treatment initiation. And if the propensity scores are not overlapping, there's very minimal overlap right there. Might be a story here where that a patient was going to get the drug no matter what, right? Or not get the drug no matter what. Another way of looking at this, again, left it off the slide deck for brevity, is, and even if you're not using propensity score modeling, that's a really neat trick here, is you can build a simple propensity score model with either deep learning statistical models, etc., and ask the question, what is the probability of getting the treatment? If the AUC is really, really, really high, like 0.999, that means that the model is, given the data, the model is dead sure that the patient's going to get the drug or not, and correct. And correct. That means something in the data is giving away the treatment. It's probably heavy confounding by indication. And no matter how much TMLE or any advanced methods you use, semi-parametric statistics or deep learning, is going to fix for that. Lastly, we want to interpret the estimates that we get from the main analysis and the sensitivity analyses in context. So we got 1.46, but don't stop there. Look at it in the context of the robustness check or reverse causation checks, the DAGs that we build. And with that, paint a very clear picture about the findings, right? Finally, rinse and repeat. We have these 4 steps. You do it once, that's fantastic. It's really good, it's a good first step, but do it again with other cohorts, with other data sets, with other methods, and triangulate. Triangulate your way to the truth, if I can put it that way. Now, all of these 5 steps, just on the last note, is really, really important. We recently saw a publication that I'm sure many of you have seen, that there is renewed interest in causal inference, a great deal of interest in causal inference, especially in the subject of study of semaglutides, these incretin-based drugs. We saw that there was a study where semaglutides were protective for Alzheimer's disease. And it was on observational data. Looked really good. The paper looked fantastic. The findings looked great. Then a trial came out and said that's not the case, right? So we're doing causal inference observational studies so we can get to the truth before randomized evidence can get there at times, either because it's too slow or it's too expensive. But we need to be careful, because if we're getting opposite answers and correct answers with regards to randomized evidence, we're really running into a wall here. We're not making any progress. So with this, I think careful assessment, careful adjustment, this safe and responsible type of framework of looking at causal analysis is incredibly important in this day and age. So with that, thank you very much.
Questions? So thank you for the really interesting talk. I was kind of wondering, one thing I've been wondering about. So Don Rubin kind of said, for objective causal inference, design trumps analysis.
Yeah.
You were just looking at kind of analysis-based approaches to dealing with confounding. Would using like an active comparator user design strengthen things? And sort of relatedly, EHR data is great because there's so much of it, but then a lot of it's not very quality. So again, like how much of this do you think could just be addressed by maybe going for a less rich data source, but which is less measurement? So like HEPFEF is a really rare disease. And shown like hypertension, which is another rare cardiovascular disease, that just generic EHR data is not sufficiently reliable to really be usable. So yeah.
I'll start with your first question. Thank you for your comments. So the first question, we looked at adjustment approaches here, but not too much at the whole design angle. I completely agree with you that design is incredibly important. It was implicit in the presentation But what needs to be said here is one of the biggest problems in our emulation of heart failure trials were the fact that we were looking at a placebo. So an active comparator could have done wonders. But the question here is in really, really sick cohorts like those with heart failure, and if drugs are guideline based, like if you have this construct, this morbidity, this contraindication, you will be getting this drug. How much can we reliably even find an active comparator? Like, we did experiments in-house, we couldn't find one. So ultimately, anyway, we went for the classic approach of actually emulating the trial. That is something versus a placebo control. But yes, if an active comparator is available, it works really well. There's a lot of studies, as you know, on SGLT2 versus DPPs, and that does show some pretty interesting and evidence that is aligned with trial evidence. So I agree. The second question. EHR is actually, so I would actually disagree with you with the heart failure. Sorry. For heart failure, yes, there's some things that you can get out of other data sets. Maybe the imaging data sets where you can get the actual ejection fraction values. But we have shown in our previous works, Kazem has led this research, of course, and he can speak to it probably more so than me. In previous years, that routine UK EHR is incredibly representative and incredibly important for heart failure research. It does capture, and Kazem and Natalie at the time published a paper in the Lancet about this. So the trends and patterns of comorbidities, prescriptions, etc., are well preserved with regards to heart failure in routine EHR. But let me get to the other bit of your question. If we did just use a simpler data set, propensity scores, everything I just said, could look really good. Like if we just adjust for age and sex, the propensity score overlap would be perfect. I mean, this is a bad example. They're showing bad overlap. It would be perfect. If we just adjust for age and sex, it'd be perfect. So we have perfect propensity score overlap, so we could just continue with causal inference, right? But no. Propensity score overlap is a function of what you've adjusted for. Those variables that remain unadjusted, it doesn't account for those. And actually, the truth is, the two cohorts could be really, really, really different when you look at the full panel of variables. So I would disagree there too, if that helps. Sorry, I didn't mean to be rude. Sorry about that, but yeah. Please. Oh, no, George, sorry, did you want to say something?
Thank you for an amazing talk. I'm just wondering if the AI-based methods might be more liable to introducing or amplifying certain biases compared to the other methods.
So the short answer is what's left off the slide deck is a thorough, so I'm not going to talk about all AI methods. I'll zoom in on targeted BERT just for now, because that's what we're working with, all right? So with targeted BERT, what's left off this slide deck is is work on showing the theoretical robustness of targeted BERT for routinely collected EHR. So that was a whole paper by itself. We did a whole bunch of semi-synthetic experiments and robustness checks to make sure it's estimating the estimate of choice with respect to a known ground truth well. So the truth is that I think how we model it and how we build a model is not susceptible, but there's another component here. It's not just about how great targeted BERT is or not. It's also about the data that you feed in, right? We specifically look at adjusting for clinical variables. This is important. There could be other data that you feed in that would be great for risk prediction or something else that gives away the outcome maybe, or gives away treatment exposure, or in our case, the causal inference setup, right? But I don't know if that would be as robust, right? Those variables are artifacts. They're not clinical variables. You want the clinical variables. So it's a two-part answer. I think our model is robust. We've shown that, but it's not just about the model. What data that we put in has to also be applicable, appropriate.
Couple of online.
Oh, great. Hey, Dexter.
No, that's, I think.
Yeah, Dexter Canoy. Yeah. It's a colleague actually on our paracetamol work. Yeah. Your thoughts on conducting EHR research when you do not have ground truth to compare against? Yeah, exactly. I mean, let me just go back to that incretin-based example, right? At the time when they did the semaglutide versus, I forget now, association study with the comparator arm was. There was no trial on Alzheimer's disease. I think, if I may be honest, I think there could have been further robustness checks in there to make sure that the estimates they derived were indeed closer to the truth than not. Because the randomized trials show the opposite evidence, the opposite findings. So I think it's important to follow such a framework as one more slide, I think. Follow such a framework when you don't have randomized evidence, because you've got to really be sure of what you're putting out there. So that's my thoughts.
You have to scroll down so you can see what.
Probably there are questions there.
Not possible.
I lost this. I lost my pointer.
Is anyone actually looking at what on their computer so they can read out?
Second one is, do you think the primary reason for achieving higher prediction performance is the predictive capability of the deep learning method employed, or the breadth and scale of the data set used?
Great question. I don't think you could disentangle the two. I mean, a model like, so this is a prediction question. It's not a causal inference question. So I want to separate that first. We didn't do prediction here, but we do show that BERT-based models are good for prediction. So BERT is this transformer neural transduction model, right? It has many layers and it works with sequential data. If we didn't have the rich EHR sequential data to put into the model, it's not worth using. In fact, when you have simpler data sets, you don't want to throw something like BERT at it. Use other tools, random forest machine learning algorithms, sure. Statistical model, sure. So it's a combination of the two that makes it happen.
Next one is, thank you for your interesting presentation. In addition to Dexter's question, were your analyses a priori driven? Was any precaution taken to consider the potential over-adjustment?
Yes, great question. I'm not, okay, so I actually don't understand what a priori driven means, but I can answer the second part of the question. Was any precaution taken to consider the potential over-adjustment? Yes, I mean, this is not, it's not a model question, it's a design question. We define baseline clearly. We adjust for variables up to baseline explicitly, and then we start looking at the follow-up period. We make sure that there is, we make sure this is the setup. The other important thing actually here as well, in addition to that, is that there could be issues of delays, but this only helps. If diseases are delayed, that means we're actually adjusting for less, right? Not more. So it works in our favor.
But that element of it, I mean, perhaps conceptually, just to clarify that in the context of those transformer-based models, other than defining which data modalities you feed into this, i.e. diagnosis and medication, and for instance, no socioeconomic status, you don't need to specify exactly which individual diagnosis you need to just adjust for. So the model just captures the context, everything up to the point of baseline. You could debate, is there over adjustment or not, but everything into that one essentially feeds into the data set.
Can I just say something about it? So maybe the over adjustment, the sense of what is meant there, I'm not sure I didn't.
Please, yeah, no worries.
Is that even if you're only adjusting for things up to baseline, it is possible, I'm not saying it's likely, it is possible that we're adjusting for things that are just colliders between causes of the exposure and causes of the outcome. And by adjusting for those, it would be opening non-causal paths that otherwise will be blocked.
Great question. So I'll take us actually back to the paper I was referring to, the targeted BERT development paper. It's not here, but what we did is we kind of probed that a little bit to the best of our abilities. What we did is we adjusted everything in the targeted BERT development work up to baseline. We observed the risk ratios across a series of experiments. We went up to baseline minus 3 months, observed the risk ratios. Baseline minus 6 months, observed the risk ratios. -9 months and 12 months. Now, there still might be colliders if you go back, but it's less likely because it's so far behind baseline. You see my point?
I see.
Yeah, so we have tried our best to look at that also from the modeling perspective with a sequence of these.
But I think that's where the a priori is coming from, like
Oh.
trying to use conceptual considerations to exclude variables that are more likely from, conceptual reasons to be just collider. I think that's, I'm just trying to
Yeah.
bring in some discussion based on the previous question. I think that's what that was the point of the question.
Yeah, I think
I think it's very hard to do it.
it's very hard to do it. And I think, I think my answer still kind of works for that too, right? If we've shown in experiments that this, if the estimate is robust to even our adjustment processes up to n number of months up to baseline, that there is mitigated concern of overadjustment, but it's not truly ruled out. We've written in the discussion of that paper, there could also be, I believe it's called the butterfly bias, butterfly overadjustment bias, could still be part of this, where colliders are being, frankly, but it's one of those things. We're trying our best to rule this out,
Yeah.
given data-driven modeling. Yeah,
That makes sense.
please.
On the paracetamol thing, there was such a big effect. If you say to a doctor, when do you give sodium and when do you not? I mean, at that effect, you should be able to find out. There should be some clinical story about it, is there?
Yeah, I mean, with the effect 1.46, is that what you
No,
meant?
well, the original too. I mean,
Oh, the original.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
why are they not fun?
I mean, that was actually our surprise. I mean, if you look at the original paper, all the line of thinking was there should be there's a preference of people taking one versus the other one, but there is no confounding indication here.
Yeah.
In fact, there is no mention of dysphagia, dementia, those things that were picked up later through the sensitivity analysis that we did. So if you would speak to people, if someone has that contextual knowledge and goes and observes, you realize, yes, actually these groups are very different. But papers have been published, including top, cardiovascular journals, just don't reflect, and in the conventional framework have not been included in the adjustment framework at all.
Yeah.
And I don't think this is an exception. I think this is the problem of using, I call it bad epidemiology, to just make causal inference.
Yeah. So actually, to just on that point, I mean, so I looked at dementia, for example, right, as one of the baseline characteristics. I just added that. I remember having a discussion with Kazem about that. We added that in the population characteristics table because we wanted to see that, and we only saw it after our whole dysphagia analysis. We want to see what was the baseline. But actually, the original paper, there was no adjustment of any of those diseases which are associated with dysphagia, with trouble swallowing. None of them. And it was odd because some of those diseases are actually diseases that almost exclusively occur in the elderly. So I feel like you should be adjusting for dementia when you're looking at patients 60 plus, by definition, but no. So this was, it was quite odd, exactly as Kazem said.
Okay. Then another thing is, so first, the ground truth studies were completely, if I'm right, the ones I used to do. I'm old, they were a long time ago. I don't know if they probably haven't. Are these the studies from 30, 40 years ago?
Yeah, I mean, the digital.
Yeah, so the management has so changed. In fact, I can't even imagine when you're saying treated versus non-treated, and someone asked about active control. I mean, the management of heart failure is so different. Like, why would these people on digoxin? Who does that anymore? What, I mean, it's so I'm not sure what we're, exactly, where the confounding is. But there's, I mean, what other drugs were they getting? Because, I mean, what did you do about that? So you see someone at a given time in that month, they didn't, let's say the digoxin, they didn't get, they got something other than digoxin or nothing.
Exactly.
What did you do?
Well, this is where it gets complex. Well, if you exclude those who are not getting digoxin but getting something else, you don't have a cohort left.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. So the placebo group were getting something else. They were getting, and Kazem, perhaps you could speak to this. I believe they're getting other drugs like beta blockers, ARBs and whatnot, heart failure drugs, but not digoxin.
Both drugs are mentioned in clinical guidelines today, right? It's not that they're obsolete. I mean, beta blockers are essentially class 1 indication, and digoxin are class 2 indication because even in those old trials, they were shown to prevent hospitalization, not death. And they're used in people with atrial fibrillation, many of whom have heart failure. And so there's overlapping population. So it's not that they're completely now off the books and everyone knows 100% this is that population that we give it to or not give it to, or they're just, I don't think that, I agree with you, but it's not about when the trials were done. It's about the complex decision-making in that complex patient population. We could have chosen newer drugs in heart failure. In fact, we considered using them. The problem is, those have been licensed just a couple of years ago. You cannot, have enough data to just test it, right? But I think the same problem would probably been present.
Well, and a lot of people on digoxin are on other drugs too, right?
Yes.
Yeah,
So there are 15 drugs plus.
So it's getting pretty complicated about what you were actually comparing this to a trial where there was one drug.
But this is the real world that people love.
Well,
right?
I'm not saying it's real world or not. I'm just trying to understand what was really happening in this thing and why it should be a comparison to a world in which there were two drugs and one was good with nothing else in the other ones.
It's a really good point because some of the success stories, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I just want to compliment you on that point there, right? Some of the success stories of TTE were the statins versus not on CAD and other diseases.
It wouldn't work.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not, but it wouldn't exactly.
They don't. It's relatively confident.
Exactly. But it makes sense because not only are patients cleaner in terms of multi-morbidity history, but there's not much else going on in terms of the things that they could have been taking. But heart failure, you get the double problem. Not only are they complex with comorbidities and prescription patterns unrelated to heart failure, but also there's a myriad of choices of drugs for heart failure itself. So we run into the real problem with the real world data, right?
I mean, just a bit of a nuance, for instance, on the beta blocker. I mean, for us, the motivation was not to just replicate them just the way it works. Actually, the underlying question for us was, are there any subpopulations within the heart failure cohort who benefit more or less? So that heterogeneity of treatment effect was the question for us. But in order to test that question, we first need to establish the overall effect that is kind of makes sense. And there have been, major individual patient data meta-analysis of clinical trials showing that despite the fact that beta blocker has a strong effect in the heart failure population, actually it has null effect in people with heart failure and atrial fibrillation. And that paper was published in the Lancet, and it has penetrated into some of the clinical guidelines. We just think, well, that's interesting. So there is no way, there would be no clinical trial ever that will test that essentially IPD meta-analysis. So we thought, well, maybe there's something else going on here. So for us, that question was, the primary question, but we didn't get as far because the experiment failed in stage 1. Or, the answer was not what we were, expecting.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. Yeah.
Another thing with the first, I have a couple of questions. Does your program, your deep,
Yeah.
Does it actually output a propensity score if you asked it to?
Yes.
Okay, and when it does a propensity score, it's taking just the fit from the past, or is it doing some grand? So it's actually, okay, are the propensity scores more extreme?
Yes.
Because that's what you'd expect by your.
That's right.
Now, when you get extreme propensity scores, the way I usually think about it is that's when you have a lot of confounding. Because here's something that every doctor would do, except these 6 didn't. Well, why not? What did they see in front of them? Everybody knows today you're supposed to do this. No, they didn't do it. And so restricting to it'd be interesting if you restrict to, people's propensity scores were between 0.4 and 0.6. Do you see such crazy results?
You nailed it. We trim off the extremes because
the other interesting thing is when you're getting extreme propensity scores, then these things, most of them aren't going to be big, confounders.
Yes.
So that's why it's interesting your standard errors are still so small, because you've got these covariates that's adjusted for who are highly correlated with exposure. That's what frequency score 0.9 mean. But I guess at least it looks like that wasn't your problem with uncertainty. I mean, statistical uncertainty. But I think excluding the very odd decisions you might see something different.
Exactly. There's an AI causal inference paper released about 2 or 3 years ago. I think the person works for Meta now, but the paper had a beautiful title, which is in reference to your point. Better AI is the depth of causal inference, or something like that. I'll tell you why. Because let's go back to adjusting for a statistical model, as I just said, with age and sex. Perfect overlap, right in the middle. Generally, pretty good overlap. You add one more variable, the overlap gets worse. You add one more variable, the overlap gets worse. And you just keep doing it, it just gets worse. Now, deep learning is the extreme of that. So the whole point of the paper is the more you adjust for, and the more deep learning extracts as even implicit interactions within what you explicitly adjusted for. It's going to be 2 bimodal peaks. There's nothing in the middle. There's no causal inference to be conducted. So hence, good deep learning is the depth of causal inference. So I thought that was, yeah.